They were reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd canto, entitled The Status Quo. Chapter 4, entitled Vidura Approaches Maitreya, and we are on text 26. Please repeat. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Text 26. Please repeat. Gurava Uvacha.
Gurava Uvacha.
Nanu te tattva samradya.
Nanu te tattva samradya.
Nanu te tattva samradya.
Nanu te tattva samradya.
Rishiko saravondike.
Rishiko saravondike.
Rishiko saravondike.
Rishiko saravondike.
Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto.
Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto.
Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto.
Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto.
Marjalokam Jihasata.
Marchalokam Jihasata.
Marjalokam Jihasata.
Marchalokam Jahasita.
Urava Uvacha.
Urava Uvacha.
Nanu te tattva samradya.
Nanu te tattva samraja.
Rishiko Sharavantike.
Rishiko saravantike.
Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto.
Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto.
Marjalokam Jihasata.
Marchalokam Jihasita.
Please chant.
Uddhava Uvacha.
Uddhava Uvacha.
Nanute Tattva Samradya.
Nanute Tattva Samraja.
Rishiko Sharavo Antike.
Rishiko saravantike.
Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto.
Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto.
Bhaktyalokam Jihasita. jihasata.
Martyalokam jihasata. Udava uvacha. Nanute tattva samraja. Rishika swaro vontike. Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto. Martyalokam jihasata. Nanute tatra samraja. Rishika Shavamontike. Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto. Martyalokam jihasata. Udava Nanute tattva samraja. Rishika Saravantike. Sakshat Bhagavata Dishto. Martyalokam jihasata.
Word for word synonyms, please repeat. Udava uvacha.
Udava uvacha.
Udava said.
Udava said.
Nanu.
Nanu.
However.
However.
Te.
Te.
Of yourself.
Of yourself.
Tattva samraja.
Tattva Raja.
One who is worshipable for reception of transcendental knowledge.
One who is worshipable for reception of transcendental knowledge.
Rishi.
Rishi.
Learned scholar.
Learned scholar.
Kosharava.
Kosharava.
Unto the son of Kusharu, Maitreya.
Unto the son Kusharu Maitreya.
Antike.
Antike.
Staying nearby.
Staying nearby.
Sakshat.
Sakshat.
Directly.
Directly.
Bhagavata.
Bhagavatam.
By the personality of Godhead.
By the personality of God.
Adishta.
Adishta.
Instructed.
Instructed.
Martyalokam.
Martyalokam.
Mortal world.
Mortal world.
Jihasata.
Jihasata.
While quitting.
While quitting.
Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Shri Uddhava said.
Shri Uddhava said. Oh.
I'll just read it. That's all right. You may take lessons. Who's Uddhava speaking to? Abhimanyu?
Midora?
Yep, you're both right, Midora. Shri Uddhava said, you may take lessons from the great learned sage Maitreya, who is nearby, and who is worshipable for reception of transcendental knowledge. He was directly instructed by the personality of Godhead, while he, the Lord, was about to quit this mortal world. Purport. Although one may be well versed in the transcendental science, one should be careful about the offense of maryada vyatikrama, or impertinently surpassing a greater personality. So maryada means etiquette, and vyatikrama means offense, a transgression. So a transgression of etiquette. According to scriptural injunction, one should be very careful of transgressing the law of maryada vyatikrama, because by so doing, one loses his duration of life, his opulence, fame, and piety, and the blessings of all the world. Quite a heavy reaction, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Even one does so impertinently. To be well versed in the transcendental science necessitates awareness of the techniques of spiritual science. This is a very important sentence. It's very pregnant with meaning. That to be well versed in the transcendental science. So we all want to be well versed in the transcendental science. Why do we want to be well versed in the transcendental science? So we can be successful in spiritual life, right? I'm not going to be a successful chemist if I'm not, learned in the science of chemistry. So, to be well versed in the transcendental science necessitates, means it's obligatory, it's mandatory. It necessitates awareness of the techniques of spiritual science. So as with every science, there's theory and then there's the application. I can study chemistry books from morning to night and have all the theories memorized. I can write it all on paper and regurgitate it, on an exam or something. But can I go to the laboratory and actually be a chemist? So it requires going to the laboratory and practice being a chemist. You can't call yourself a chemist just because you've read all the chemistry books in the world. You have to, as Prabhupada says, you have to be aware of the techniques of the science. So you can read about how to synthesize aspirin in the, any of us can go to the library and get a chemistry book out, and you can see the whole chemical formula for aspirin. You can see the whole, procedure, how you're supposed to, you can synthesize aspirin in your garage.
Nobody goes to the library today, so Google.
That's right. Just Google it. Google Acharya will tell you how to synthesize aspirin in your garage. But what about the technique? It'll say, boil this, distill this, do that. Now you have to go to the laboratory and you got to practice. What does it mean? Oh yeah, you do that. There's a whole technique. You can't just read it. So as Prabhupada's also saying that we have a spiritual science. He would say Krishna consciousness is a spiritual science, not just a faith, right? So to be well versed in the transcendental science necessitates awareness of the techniques of spiritual science. Uddhava, being well aware of all these technicalities of transcendental science, advised Vidura to approach Maitreya Rishi to receive transcendental knowledge. Vidura wanted to accept Uddhava as his spiritual master, but Uddhava did not accept the post, because Vidura was as old as Uddhava's father, and therefore Uddhava could not accept him as his disciple, especially when Maitreya was present nearby. The rule is that in the presence of a higher personality, one should not be very eager to impart instructions, even if one is competent and well-versed. So Uddhava decided to send an elderly person like Vidura to Maitreya, another elderly person. But he was also well-versed because he was directly instructed by the Lord while he was about to quit this mortal world. Since both Uddhava and Maitreya were directly instructed by the Lord, both had the authority to become the spiritual master of Vidura or anyone else. But Maitreya, being elderly, had the first claim to becoming the spiritual master, especially for Vidura, who was much older than Uddhava. One should not be eager to become a spiritual master cheaply for the sake of profit and fame, but should become a spiritual master only for the service of the Lord. The Lord never tolerates the impertinence of Maryada Vyatikrama. What did we say Maryada Vyatikrama means, Abhimanyu?
Transgression of etiquette or offense.
Yes,
Etiquette.
exactly. One should never pass over the honor due to an elderly spiritual master in the interest of one's own personal gain and fame. Impertinence on the part of the pseudo-spiritual master is very risky to progressive spiritual realization. End of Srila Prabhupada's purport. So, kind of a straightforward, simple point, but a very, very significant instruction given by Uddhava's example and by Prabhupada's purport, that as aspiring Vaishnavas, we want our pursuit of Krishna prema to be successful. Because if it's not, we're going to have to take birth again and again and again and again and keep doing it till you get it right. Did you ever take a course in like high school that you just didn't like? And you're just like, I can't wait till the semester's over and I'm done with this, right? Like algebra 2 or something, you know, I'll be done with this. All I gotta do is get a C- and I'll pass, right? We knew a student at the University of Illinois, he said, D's do degrees. So he was like, as long as I get a D, not an F, right? If I just get a D and get out of here. Well, it doesn't work in Krishna consciousness. It's not just pass, fail, satisfactory, unsatisfactory. You have to get an A+, plus, 100%. So D's don't do degrees in Krishna consciousness. You have to go back and take your algebra 2 class 500 times until you ace it. You know? So like that, we have to keep coming here and being a sadhaka, being a sadhaka, being a sadhaka, being a sadhaka, until we become a siddha, or perfect. So here, Prabhupada's making the very important point, it is not an intellectual accomplishment, that I'm going to become well-versed in the Gaudiya Vaishnava Shastra. I'll just memorize every verse, backwards and forwards and inside out. I can defeat Mayavad philosophy, this, that, and the other thing. He said, no, being well-versed in the spiritual science necessitates awareness of the techniques of spiritual science. You have to know the proper way to apply things, not just speak the theory. So that's the difference between a jnani and a bhakta. A jnani is one who just wants knowledge, and a bhakta wants devotion. Devotion means loving service. So then what is this Vaishnava etiquette that Prabhupada saying it necessitates our understanding? Vaishnava etiquette, Vaishnava behavior. In the Nectar of Instruction, Prabhupada's translation of Srila Rupa Goswami's Upadeshamrita, Rupa Goswami says that there's 6 types of interactions devotees should have with each other, and that this constitutes loving exchange. For example, he does not say we should hang out together and talk prajalpa, or we should hang out together and do some sense gratification. You know, if I do it with Vaishnavas, it's better. You know, it's okay. If I do it with non-devotees, it's not okay. But if I do it with Vaishnavas, it's okay. No, Rupa Goswami doesn't say that. He only gives us 6 things of loving exchanges. Dadati pratigrinati guyam akyati prichati bhute pujayate chaiva shadvidham priti lakshana. Offering gifts in charity means giving each other gifts and accepting the charitable gifts. Revealing one's mind in confidence, which means I inquire, I ask questions. How can I improve in my devotional service? How can I understand this philosophy? How can I overcome my anarthas? How can I serve better? And so revealing one's mind in confidence, inquiring confidentially, which means there's going to be a receiver of those confidential inquiries who's going to answer them. Accepting prasad, we're all very good at that one, and offering prasad. Those are the 6 symptoms of love shared by one devotee and another. So then in the next verse, 5, Rupa Goswami continues to say how we should treat other devotees. So he says that one should mentally honor the devotee who chants the holy name of Lord Krishna. So anybody who chants Hare Krishna, we honor them. And one should offer humble obeisances. To those devotees who have undergone spiritual initiation, diksha, and is engaged in worshiping the deity. So this is referring to those who have what we call in ISKCON second initiation. And one should associate with and faithfully serve that pure devotee who's advanced in undeviated devotional service and whose heart is completely devoid of the propensity to criticize others. That's a high-level devotee. That they're advanced in undeviated devotional service and their heart is devoid of the propensity to criticize others. So Prabhupada begins his purport by saying that in order to intelligently apply the sixfold loving reciprocations mentioned in the previous verse, one must select proper persons with careful discrimination. So our difficulty is, our problem is that as neophytes, as immature devotees, we lack discrimination. So we tend to reveal our mind and look for instruction, maybe from the wrong person. So Prabhupada's making the point here that not to be in a judgmental mood, but to discern the different levels of devotees so you know who you're supposed to give mercy to and who you're supposed to take mercy from, who you're supposed to inquire from confidentially, and who you're supposed to, listen to their problems and their questions confidentially. So if we don't understand the different grades of devotees, then we will not interact with them properly. So, Vaishnava etiquette. It's a deep subject matter, but Prabhupada's making the point in the purport that we must understand proper etiquette, proper behavior, because that's the technique of spiritual science, and one won't actually make advancement properly if one doesn't know the etiquette. So we have etiquette between Vaishnava and Vaishnava. We have etiquette between Vaishnava and Guru. We have etiquette between the Vaishnava and the deity, right? Cleanliness, punctuality, all that. And we have etiquette between the Vaishnava and the holy name, right? And upholding these systems of etiquette are very, very important. So one time in Chaitanya Lila, Vallabha is the Acharya of the Vallabha Acharya Sampradaya. It's a branch of the Rudra Sampradaya. So of the four Vaishnava Sampradayas, Brahma Sampradaya, Sri Sampradaya, Kumar Sampradaya, and Rudra Sampradaya. In the Rudra Sampradaya comes Vishnu Swami, and then from him there's some branches, and one of those is Vallabha. And so his Sampradaya is mostly found in Western India, primarily in the state of Gujarat, and it's called the Pushti Marg. So one day Vallabha Bhatt approached Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and told him that I don't understand why you people are always chanting the name of Krishna, because God is like the husband and we're like the wives. And he said the proper etiquette is that the wife doesn't recite the name of the husband. She might call her husband Prabhu, but she doesn't call him by name. So you all are calling the Lord by his name, and that's not proper. And Sridhar Swami said that you should, but I disagree with him. So he said that Vallabha said that I've written a commentary on Bhagavatam, which is better than Sridhar Swami's commentary. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu chastised him. And first of all, he corrected him in two ways. He corrected him and said that actually the primary duty of a chaste wife is to follow the instruction of the husband. And the husband, in this case we're saying the Lord himself, he gives us the instruction to chant his holy names. So therefore we chant Krishna, 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 because that's the instruction. We're like the chaste wife who follows the instruction. And secondly, you nonsense, how dare you say that you've written a better commentary than Sridhar Swami? You know, this is total nonsense. So he chastised Vallabha, and Vallabha did indeed accept that chastisement and became purified. So Prabhupada was making that point in today's purport, to try to supersede a previous acharya or higher devotee or authority in the name of being, you know, an acharya themselves. Sanatana Goswami one time was going to visit Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in Jagannath Puri. And Sanatana Goswami had left his job as a magistrate or whatever, government position under the Muslim rule, but he considered himself contaminated by working for the Muslims. And he was very, very humble. So one day he went to Jagannath Puri to see Lord Chaitanya. And he also, for some reason, Sanatana Goswami had broken out with some kind of skin disease. He had pussy sores all over his body that were weeping. So it was like really kind of gross, you know. So he didn't want. Anyway, so he went to go see the Lord in Puri, and in order to do so, he had to walk there to the spot where Lord Chaitanya was. Lord Chaitanya called him. He invited, oh, Sanatana's in Puri, please have him come. So from the place where Sanatana was staying, he had to walk past the Jagannath temple to get to the room where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was. But he didn't want to walk right in front of the Jagannath temple because all of the priests are out there, you know, and he felt like, ooh, I've got all these sores weeping on my body, and I'm contaminated by my Muslim association. I shouldn't go by those priests because, at least in those days, I don't know how strict it is today, the priests would be very careful not to touch anybody that was unclean, because they're directly dealing with the deity. You've got to be 100% clean. So you can't touch anything or anybody that's dirty and then go on the altar. So they were very careful to not, you know, mix with the public and get dirty, get contaminated. So Sanatana said, well, I can't walk by the front gate of the temple because I'll contaminate the pujaris. So he took the long route to get to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's room, and he had to go along the beach. But it was the month of May, which is really, really hot in India, and he was walking barefoot on the sand, and it was so hot, it burned his feet and put blisters all over the bottom of his feet. But he tolerated it, because yay, I'm going to go see Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So he went and he met Lord Chaitanya, and Lord Chaitanya, just to glorify his devotee, he said, Sanatana, how did you get here? He said, oh, I walked, you know, on the beach, and I came like this, and now here I am. What'd you do that for? That's such a long, why didn't you just take the beeline, you know, come across the front gate of the temple? No, I couldn't do that because I didn't want to contaminate the pujaris. So Lord Chaitanya was very pleased when he heard this behavior. And he said to Sanatana, my dear Sanatana, although you are the deliverer of the entire universe, and although even the demigods and great saints are purified by touching you, it is the characteristic of a devotee to observe and protect the Vaishnava etiquette. Maintenance of Vaishnava etiquette is the ornament of a devotee. Very nice. Maintenance of Vaishnava etiquette is the ornament of a devotee. If one transgresses the laws of etiquette, people make fun of him, and thus he's vanquished in both this world and the next. By observing the etiquette, you have satisfied my mind. Who else but you could show this example? So following Vaishnava etiquette satisfies the Lord. And that's the real reason why we do it. It satisfies the Vaishnavas, and therefore it satisfies the Lord. So it behooves each of us to follow the proper Vaishnava etiquette. And of all the Vaishnavas, the Guru is the one who's obviously most elevated and who we want to properly interact with. Lakshmi, you're saying you had something?
Yeah, I thought Sanatana Goswami met Mahaprabhu in Allahabad. Yeah.
Was it? I thought it said
Really
Jagannath.
polite though.
Yeah,
No,
the first,
right,
that was his first meeting,
Yeah, that was another meeting, I believe.
Yeah,
but then later he came to Puri.
yeah.
That past time he followed the Bhat that I said, that was outside Prayag. If this was in Jagannath Puri, he didn't want to go by the Sringadwara gates. He didn't want to contaminate the pandas, you know? Yeah. So anyway, we want to behave properly with all devotees, but especially with the spiritual master, because Yasya Prasada, you know, Abhi, when you attend Mangal Arti, we sing 8 verses called the Guruvastakam, and the last of those starts off Yasya Prasada Bhagavat Prasada Yasya Prasada Nagati Kutopi, that if we get the mercy of the spiritual master, then we get the mercy of Krishna. And if we don't please the spiritual master and therefore don't get his mercy, then there's no question of getting the mercy of Krishna. That's verse number 8. So getting the mercy of the spiritual master involves following the spiritual master's instructions. Well, it's part of it at least, big part of it. So we also in the morning recite, I believe, we recite the 10 offenses to the holy name, right? And number 3 is to minimize or disobey the instructions of the spiritual master. So we shouldn't take him as an ordinary person. Whatever he says, yeah, I got a better idea, you know. So Prabhupada said there's a spiritual technique. There's a technique to this spiritual science. And if we don't follow it, we're not going to have success. And the major part of that technique is what's given by the spiritual master. The spiritual master is telling us how many rounds to chant, what the regular principles are, what he's expecting of us as far as like our attendance at the morning program, service, right? Otherwise, different spiritual masters will give in different times, places, and circumstances, and in different institutions, will give their particular disciples different instructions. So in ISKCON, Prabhupada said 16 rounds, 4 regular principles. And other gurus and other institutions might say 4 rounds, and they don't maybe stress as many or any regular principles. But we have to follow our founder Acharya, Srila Prabhupada. We can't say, well, over there, they do it like this and like that, so why can't I do it like that? Well, no. If you want to be in Prabhupada's lineage, you got to follow his technique. So it behooves us to follow Prabhupada's instructions, which entails attendance at the morning program, chanting 16 rounds a day, following the 4 regular principles, and doing some practical devotional service. And if we're not doing those things, we can't call ourselves a disciple or an aspiring disciple. So it behooves us to implement all those instructions in our life, and it also behooves us to make sure our subordinates are doing so. You know, if we have our children or our students, you know, or the bhaktas under us, you know, whatever it is, it behooves us to make sure they're following Prabhupada's instructions. Because just like when there's a crime committed, you didn't pull the trigger and murder that person, but you might have been complicit in the crime because you drove the car so that person could get there to murder that guy, or you turned a blind eye and didn't call the police or something. You know, we become complicit. So it actually behooves us to uphold Prabhupada's standards and instructions and make sure that the people under our care or the people that we care about are following properly. If we don't, then they're going to suffer, they're not going to make any advancement whatsoever, and then we're stuck with a bunch of people around us that aren't making any spiritual advancement. Who wants that? And then we ourselves won't make spiritual advancement because we'll be negligent in our duty, we'll become complicit in the crime. What is the crime? Guru Aparad. The third offense to the holy name. So we really, 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 really have to take responsibility. And as Lord Chaitanya said to Sanatana Goswami, you're upholding and maintaining and protecting the Vaishnava etiquette is your ornament. That's the ornament of a devotee. It's how you know this is a devotee, because they stand up for Vaishnava etiquette. Okay, we'll stop there, see if there's any discussion.
The Vallabha Acharya example, I think I mentioned it a few months ago or so, that Prabhupada spoke about it as you were doing in a lecture. I don't remember the year, but then it was printed in a Bhakti Godhead magazine. And Sumati Moraji read it, and she's a follower of that set, of that Vaishnava.
Pushti Margyan.
And she was very upset. And it created a huge problem. And Prabhupada explained it. He said there's two different truths. One is spoken, according to time, place, and circumstance. But there's also the truth of what the scriptures say. And I forget the term he used. But so he also then very carefully explained how he had committed that offense, but that he accepted it, and Lord Chaitanya accepted his acceptance of it, and that later on that pastime, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had invited him for lunch, and they had a very healthy spiritual relationship. But it did great harm to ISKCON's relationship. The head priest never really accepted the apology, I think, and lots of life members were lost in that little. Prabhupada said that you have to be more careful about how you. Like I had an experience that, to this day I really can't even understand. We were new to having Indians in Atlanta. They weren't. The Indians were afraid to come to they were in New York, Chicago, LA, but they didn't want to come to the South because they thought they would be treated like African Americans. They thought because they're brown that they would be treated in a different way. So they were very slow to come to the South. And then gradually they started coming down. So we just had a little bit of experience. That was one of the reasons why Takamara suggested we have some Indian devotees come over and help us. So I was giving a talk at a Sunday feast, and all he did was quote exactly what Prabhupada said in the Shirsh Upanishad about, the four tendencies of making mistakes, being an illusion, imperfect senses, being cheated, or being a cheater. And the mistake that Prabhupada mentions is that Gandhi made a mistake by going to a meeting in Delhi, and he was murdered. So I just mentioned that as not as a insult to Gandhi, I just repeated. And this man just jumped up. He ruined the whole thing. I'd set up a whole pandal and everything out in the park across from the temple. It was a real big event. And I just like, oh my God, everybody's looking at me like, you stupid fool. I just didn't grasp, how important Gandhi is to them. And so, I'm just mentioning that sometimes we know these things, but we have to, not that we don't speak the truth, but we have to be careful about, you have to gauge the audience, because, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the interesting thing about that pastime with Vallabha is that by Lord Chaitanya's blessings, he became Vallabhacharya,
Right.
the head of his own little branch,
Exactly.
Sampradaya. And actually this pastime glorifies Vallabha because he showed his true Vaishnava quality of being willing to correct his mistakes. And he submitted to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and that proved that he was a real Vaishnava, that pride was just a temporary pride that the Lord was able to smash quite easily. So, you know, we're all going to commit offenses, come on. We're all going to be guilty of pride and arrogance and all this stuff. That's not the problem. The problem is when we don't relinquish that and we don't become humble and say, I'm sorry, I really goofed, you know? Let me take shelter again properly. So Vaishnava is actually, you know, glorious if you look at that pastime with how it turned out. You know, he didn't just run away and say, yeah, you know.
But I think Prabhupada wanted them to do in the future to be, because he was just speaking in a Western environment, and what he said is exactly what it says in Chaitanya Charitamrita. It's an example of trying to surpass the previous acharya. But you know, if you go further, so Prabhupada was saying when you're printing something like this, there should be footnotes or something to that effect that expands upon. Even though Prabhupada didn't say it in the lecture, there should have been a footnote reference to refer them to the Chaitanya Charitamrita. So,
Yeah, because it said here in Prabhupada's purport today that if one does commit Maryada Vyatikrama, one's life is ruined. But Vaishnava's life wasn't
Was
ruined.
not
He
ruined.
became Vallabhacharya, you know, head of the Pushti Marg.
Sure.
So,
I heard that, I read an article that it was his sons who started the Pushti Marg because they were offended by Lord Chaitanya, that what went down with his father, their father. And so he really didn't have that much to do with it because it was after his demise that.
yeah, I'm not sure.
It's the long history, and they had a lot of evidence. So,
What you mean, recently, or you
when
talking?
when it began, that's after
Oh, okay.
all of the stories Sampradaya.
Oh,
Yeah, but Prabhupada describes it in a better light than
Yes.
that.
Because it's hard to imagine him leaving Lord Chaitanya after all that.
Prabhupada,
His relatives-
Prabhupada gives a much brighter picture than that in his
well, isn't
purports.
he mentioning him in the front of the Bhagavad Gita or something? Who's that? Not Baldev, Vishnu.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else? Okay, we'll stop there. Grantara Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai,
Jai.
Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.
Jai.
Oh, Krishna.
I remember I committed Maryada Vyatikrama so many
Right,
times.
text 27 tomorrow.
And he wants to go on.